thanks for the kind invitation. I guess that I have been also invited at the rest of the colleagues because we have been working quite intensively on the economic and social ecological impact of the COVID-19 on fisheries and aquaculture, mainly here in Europe, but also in Latin America as well as partially in Africa. But I will try to focus my presentation on from a general perspective about how we should or try to understand what are the impacts, the response in order to build resilience from the seafood perspective, and also then focus a little bit on the European perspective, and then on a more refined consideration focusing on the on one specific site here in Spain, which is probably one of the most important fishing region in Europe, and then continue with some lessons from the past and for the future. Well, some important considerations in relation to this European seafood sector, because sometimes we usually not take into account properly. The first one is that the seafood in general is among the most traded food commodities in the world right now. And under this context, the European Union we are the largest seafood market in the world. So we are a key player with a lot of connections to supply and also from the demand side, and acting and developing a key role in the global seafood markets. This expansion of the seafood, not only in Europe but also globally during the last 5 decades, has resulted in a wide range of socioeconomic benefits in terms of revenues, employment opportunities, and also food security. But also it makes the food system even more vulnerable or fragile to potential abrupt or slow systemic shocks like the COVID-19 that we are suffering, that it has the capacity to disrupt the flow of product and the livelihoods that depend on it. And these type of shocks are becoming increasingly common for the food systems during the last couple of years. And this is a trend that, according to the scientific community, that is expected to be continued, unfortunately, given the current challenge presented in a combination with climate change and biodiversity loss, as already stated by the IPBES or the IPPC reports lately. In terms focusing on the seafood or on the fishery sector itself, globally the COVID-19 pandemic has forced national government to impose temporal cessation of large parts of their economies to ensure social distance and reduce inflation rates more generally. And this has a large impact on the fishery sector. And for example, we are observing a global reduction of land-based and fishing activity. Of course, this is diverse and differs from different regions and countries, but partially due to the decline in the demand of seafood, but also because of sanitary measures to ensure social distance. And both the COVID-19 outbreak as well as the different response and the enabling conditions of the countries or regions have the potential to affect the seafood sector in a multiple ways, from low to huge impact. In order to try to understand resilience in the food sector, it is important to try to include in the table of our analysis some key elements, such as those included in this food system resilience action cycle framework, by including concept of coping, adaptation, and also resilience. And also from the seafood perspective, we agreed to use the term of resilience to mean the capacity over time of a food system and its units at multiple levels to provide appropriate and accessible food or seafood to all in the face of various and even unforeseen disturbance and shocks. And based on the framework, we will be able to identify a wide range of disruptions at multiple levels of supply chains. And these disruptions has caused a wide range of impact across different subsectors: fisheries, aquaculture, processing sector, product forms, markets, as well as consumer segments. And as we know, impact from the pandemic were felt first in China and among its trading partners, but quickly spread around the world from the seafood perspective as well. And in some cases, disruptions also occur simultaneously to multiple stages of the value chain. And these type of disruptions in some regions or sectors could be and has been, in fact, magnified by existing previous stressors like climate change or biodiversity loss. And as we can see, there are at least 4 types of disruptions. Demand disruptions, for example, in the European Union, the lower demand at restaurants led to a 30% drop in imported live fresh seafood prices due to the COVID. We also should be able to incorporate in our understanding about socio-ecological crisis distribution disruptions. Seafood trade in Europe was disrupted or even redirected or halted by sudden shift in demand, supply, and limits on the movement of goods and people. For example, canceled international passenger flight created logistical problems and increased air freight cost for high-value seafood products such as the farmed Atlantic salmon in Europe. In terms of the labor disruptions, lockdowns disrupted employment in seafood supply chain for workers and access to labor for seafood business in general. We will see that this has a different impact on fisheries and aquaculture. And also, the COVID disruption has affected also the production of fisheries and aquaculture and processing. And for example, the COVID-related lockdown has decreased industrial fishing for example, in China, in Spain, France, and Italy, very important seafood key players in Europe and also globally by around 40 to 50% in the first quarter of 2020 compared to 2019. If we look at, for example, at how the COVID and this social ecological crisis affected the impact of the fishery sector, this is the result of the very recent report that we developed for the European Commission within the Scientific, Economic, and Technical Fisheries Committee. And as you can see, our preliminary results indicate a decrease of around 20% in landed value in 2020 compared to 2019, and a similar fall in gross value added of around 16% is expected for the European fishing fleet, which is in fact quite higher compared to the 80% reduction in the gross domestic product estimated by the European Commission for the whole European economy in 2020. But apart from that, I would like to also highlight that the impact has been quite different if we focus on large-scale fisheries or small-scale fisheries. As we can see, small-scale fisheries has been significantly reduced in terms of the landings, while the large-scale fisheries has been less impacted. Considering different indicators, like for example, value of landings, full-time employment, or gross profits, among others. If we look at the of the COVID-19 impact on the aquaculture sector, we also coordinated the work within the SINTEF committee for the COVID-19 impact in the whole aquaculture sector in Europe, and this is the key result we obtained, consulting not only the expert but also developing Delphi method as well as with the combination of official data. And as you can see, there is a wide range of impact on the different key indicators that we use for the European Commission report. In general, as we can see, both the fishery sector and the aquaculture are characterized by the wide range of interconnected impacts of across country, seafood systems, and regions. I do not want to go in detail on these numbers, but just to figure out how the COVID-19 impact affected the aquaculture sector on the different type of segments, like shellfish, for example, here in Spain, which is here in Galicia, for example, apart from China, is we have the largest mussel production in Europe, and it was quite affected in sales volume, total income, as well as turnover. But just to share with you some of the examples. But let me focus a bit more in detail on the COVID impact in Galicia for at least two reasons. The first one is that here the Galician region in the northwest of Spain is the European region with the highest dependence in Europe on seafood trade, fishing activities, small-scale fisheries, and also aquaculture. And probably the second reason for me is probably more important, because sociocultural context and the naval conditions are usually considered key from the resilience theory in order to facilitate or hinder adaptation and transformation, which are both key elements, an essential element for transformative or adaptive response to their will social ecological crisis. And just to very briefly to share with you, here in Galicia we have 6 economic sectors, all of them highly dynamic and with huge socioeconomic importance for coastal communities. And here we focus not only on the first early COVID-19 impact on the extractive fishery sector, but also on the capacity of the aquaculture as well as the canned industry to supply not only the Galician market, but also the international seafood market, because here the sector is quite dynamic and operating globally. This is one of the variables that we have used. We compare the landings reported by the Galician actual market compared to the 5 years period previous to the COVID-19 in 2015 and 2019. And as we can see, there is an important reduction both in volume and in value, which are indeed quite similar to our result we found for the average impact of the entire European fishing fleet. But as we can see, these are this impact has been affected differently, all of the categories, because not all of these species have been equally affected, and only 2 of them, just to give you a couple of examples, show positive trends. And here we are talking about key species that are very important for coastal community, not only in revenue, but also because they are providing marine protein, which contribute to reduce, for example, cardiovascular problems and contribute to the Mediterranean diet in the southern part of Europe. But most of the studies that we have in review is when we were analyzing the COVID-19 impact on the fishery sector in Europe, are focusing on a specific sector like fisheries or aquaculture. However, in my view, it's, as we stated in the beginning of my presentation, it is also important to consider not only the early impact and response on the fishery sector, which are part only of the local production, but also the seafood trade, because a socio-ecological crisis could potentially affect the capacity of the seafood sector to cover the seafood demand by, for example, imports or an exports. And as we can see, there are other sectors apart from fisheries that has been also affected by volume and in value, like, for example, aquaculture, or as well as also the imports and export, both in volume and in billion of euros. Mainly due to the initial shock of the lockdown in other traditional international or European markets such as France, Italy, Portugal, or the US. However, not all of the economic sector has been equally affected, as we said previously. For example, most of the mussel aquaculture production and part of the shell fisheries production of clams and cockles which are highly evaluated international markets, has been successfully sold to the canned industry due to the close of the HoReCa challenge, showing an early and positive response to the COVID-19 impact. We also try to better understand this COVID impact on the household expenditure on seafood, because here we have probably the highest household expenditure on seafood in Spain. And by using monthly data for frozen, canned, and fresh product for the previous 5-year period to the COVID-19, we observe, for example, that expenditure on fresh products show a notable increase in March 2020 to then stabilize over time, while expenditure on canned fish products substantially increased during the first quarter of 2020 by following a previous growing trend before the COVID-19 to then recover for Christmas times. Finally, we also analyzed the evolution of the monthly data of import and export, including fresh, live, and frozen seafood on the one hand, and on the other, trends for the prepared and preserved seafood, basically those related to the canned industry. The initial COVID-19 impact was to reduce the seafood trade of fresh, live, and frozen seafood, especially the export in value, but the adaptive capacity of the Galician sector allowed it to react quite quickly and recover from the initial shock. However, the COVID-19 seems to not affect the capacity of the canned industry, because imports of prepared and preserved seafood follow a similar trend compared to the previous 5-year period, while the sector, according to our work here in Spain, show or indicate that have the capacity to detect this initial COVID impact, because this sector is operating globally, especially also and also competing with Asian countries, and was able to detect the impact in international market before arriving to Spain. And this is by showing an increasing trend of export both in volume and value. And basically because they shift the seafood export from European or international market to basically develop the strategy to supply the rest of the Spanish territories. I would like, we also review the main lessons from the past, from this early reaction to COVID-19 impact in relation specifically to the seafood sector. And according to what we know until now, the response were mostly aimed to 3 aspects or points. The first one is that the response were mainly to protect public health, including the health of the fisheries and aquaculture sector. For example, seafood sector in different countries were, not only here in Europe, but also internationally, were quickly labeled as essential workers in order to maintain the food supply for the population. The second response or early reaction were able to support those enterprises, jobs, and incomes which has been affected by the COVID-19 and related disruptions. And it's important to distinguish the large-scale operation actors and those small-scale fish workers, which have different strategies and response to deal with the COVID-19 in Europe. And finally, the third response was basically to try to maintain the seafood supply to consumers. But it is important to know not only what has been passing, what has been happening during the last year, and also, but also consider to try to avoid some key lessons from the past that we have already known. And we have identified at least 3 key main lessons or actions or points that we think that we need to consider when building resilience in the seafood sector. The first one is to try, if possible, to avoid trade bans and hoarding behavior. This happened during the 2008 grain crisis, for example, and still it would be desirable to try to maintain food supply buffers and even cooperate internationally. The second one is that we need to try to avoid overfishing that can harm fish population and the environment. This already happened in Europe after the Second World War, and also, for example, outside Europe in Sri Lanka after the tsunami in 2004. It could be the tendency of the governments to try to overstimulate the production after this large impact of the COVID-19, and this is a risk that we need to try to think carefully to avoid. And the third one is, during past shocks, the quality of the diet often suffers as families shift purchasing behavior to less expensive, stable foods, and this has also consequence on the obesity and on the health of the populations. Just to finish my presentation, the economic crisis originated by the COVID-19 outbreak and subsequent lockdown for the seafood sector, the fisheries and aquaculture sector, presented the situation of a weaker demand due to the lower fisheries and aquaculture production and imports, but partially compensated by a good response of other sectors, like, for example, the canned industry. We observe also some sort of, in general, a price stabilization by supporting, for example, cold storage in fisheries, retailers and processors are also confronted with limited stocking capacity. We also observe a weaker demand due to lower purchasing power and the closure of traditional channels, hotels and restaurants, which mainly generated a drop in first-sale prices, especially in the beginning of the COVID-19 in March 2020. And also there are some segments of the aquaculture, but also of the fishery sector that we saw their demand reduce, especially those who has a strategy to export most of the production, as major markets such as Italy, France, Spain, or Portugal, for example, has been largely closed, especially in the first lockdown. And finally, given that the seafood sector operates within the limits of the biosphere, there are also some other general considerations that we need to be considered taking into account when building resilience. The COVID-19 has showed again, or even more visible, that we are living in an interconnected and coupled globalized world within a rapid change. It also reveals some vulnerabilities, but also opportunities for future shocks. And also, as the pandemic spreads, a patchwork of impact and response are still occurring across different seafood sectors and across scales from local, national, and international one. In order to try to build resilience in the seafood sector, it is important to consider strategies to absorb shocks, how we react, including the enabling conditions and the driver of change, like climate change or biodiversity loss, and co-develop with key actors, governments, those affected users like the fisheries and aquaculture sector, to develop contingency plans and also adaptive capacity and even transformative change are critical in this phase. And finally, as a potential solution or instrument, emergent technology like online trade for seafood, which has been shown a positive response for some of the small-scale fisheries in Europe, for example, or social innovations like, for example, more cooperation between different actors across the value chain, and also consider a wide range or diverse portfolio of active stewardship of human actions in support of a resilient seafood system, in my view, is quite important, especially related to a more equitable distribution of economic, social, and health benefits. Thank you.